Welcome to Sports Coach Radio. It's always an honor to have a true master coach on the show. This week, sports renaissance man Dan Pfaff joins us. Coach Pfaff has worked with 49 Olympians, including 9 medalists, most recently helping Britain's long jumper Greg Rutherford win a gold medal in London. The Canadian 100-meter champion Donovan Bailey was also one of his charges. Among Coach Pfaff's many other achievements, he has tutored 5 world record holders. He's also served on 5 Olympic Games coaching staffs in 5 different countries and 9 World Championship staffs in 6 different countries. Coach Pfaff has also provided consultancy to players and teams in professional football, baseball, hockey, golf, tennis, European soccer, and the Canadian Winter Olympic program. He was appointed in 2013 as Education Director and Jumps Coach at the newly created World Athletic Center in Phoenix, Arizona. Sports Coach Radio is a weekly series of in-depth interviews hosted by me, Glenn Whitney. I'm a coaching psychologist. You can follow us on Twitter, where we post tips and links to interesting articles just about every day of the week. The handle is @SportsCoachTalk. And if you're listening to us via Apple iTunes, please leave a short review. It's much appreciated. Coach Pfaff, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Can we start with your earliest phase when you started to take this whole coaching profession seriously? Was there a time when you maybe switched out of one area to another, when it became more of a full-time career for you?
Yeah, I would say that I've always kind of had a coaching instinct. Even when I was an athlete, I was always kind of the ringleader of neighborhood sports or games or what have you. But when I was in university, my personal athletic career, it was becoming real obvious I wasn't going to go a lot further. So I started volunteering at my old high school, coaching American football, wrestling, and track and field, and caught the bug being a volunteer.
And you were about how old at that stage?
I was probably 19 years old.
Okay. And then when did it become something that you could earn a living at?
Well, according to my wife, I still haven't made that threshold. But being a paid coach right out of university, I was hired at a small village school in Ohio to coach football and intramural sports and wrestling and track and field. And I was a comprehensive science teacher also. Mm-hmm. So I taught chemistry and physics and anatomy and biology and earth science. If it was science, I taught it. Like I said, it was a small village-type school.
And then I take it that you gradually transitioned over to focusing primarily, I don't know what the right word is, on track and field. Were there some key moments in that process of transitioning over there?
Yeah, when I was a high school coach, I used to attend a lot of coaching schools and clinics, and I became enamored with a coach named Tom Tellez, who was the coach of Carl Lewis and Mike Marsh and Leroy Burrell, people like that. And he was the first guy I heard that, talked strictly in scientific realms and, mechanics and physiology. And I think 6 years into high school coaching, my wife and I packed everything up and moved to Houston, and I was an unpaid graduate assistant for Coach Tellez for 2 years. So that's where, if you want to say, I kind of drifted into one sport. That's where that happened.
And what sort of athletes were you working with at the time?
Well, at the time, I was a gopher, so, whoever was on the track, maybe I timed workouts, maybe I raked pits, maybe I caught takeoff steps, maybe I did video, maybe I did film breakdown. So it was truly, across-the-board mentorship, if you will, standing behind, one of the probably the world's leading teachers in the sport every day. So, I was a kid in a candy store, every day I went to practice.
And who were the leading track athletes at that time, nationally?
Well, my first 2 years there were Carl Lewis's first 2 years in university. Mm-hmm. And and that was also the boycott year, 1980. So there were a lot of Olympians training there for the U.S. team. And then when the announcement of the boycott came across, it was kind of like ground zero. So, I was there to watch, probably 20 or 30 dreams die on the spot.
Yeah, must have been quite an emotional experience.
Yeah, it was, it's still here. And, whenever I hear people talk about boycotting stuff, I get pretty riled up.
Mm-hmm. So you're paying your dues in those years, and then was there a breakthrough moment, or was there a key assignment or project that you got involved in?
No, I just did the journey from Houston. I was an assistant coach at Wichita State in Kansas, and then moved up to a job at Texas El Paso. That was probably a launching pad because there were a lot of international athletes at UTEP at the time. From there, I went to LSU for 11 years, where we took a program that was at ground zero into what it is today. And then from LSU, I moved to the University of Texas and spent 8 years there, and then worked as an independent consultant for a few years and coached at the University of Florida for a couple of years, and then some private centers, and then I ran the USOC Training Center in Chula Vista, California for a year. And then Charles contacted me about the UK gigs. So the last 4 years I was in the UK, leading up through the games, and now I'm back at a private center here in Phoenix called the World Athletics Center.
Mm-hmm. Now, you're very well known, of course, for working with Donovan Bailey, but I assume that didn't just come out of nowhere. What was the build-up to that?
Well, I was at LSU at the time, and there was a Canadian athlete that I was working with, Glenroy Gilbert, and he was a long jumper and had some injuries, so we started sprinting him a little bit more to get points out of him, and he took off and became an All-American in the 100 and the 200 for LSU. And next thing I know, Canadian sprinters are showing up like crazy because they were curious how this long jump guy all of a sudden became a 10-0 sprinter. Mm-hmm. So that's how it started. And Glenroy ended up being the second leg on the 3 gold medal relay teams they had there in 95, 96, and 97. So, a lot of credit goes to Glenroy and his recruiting and building, the sprint squad that we ended up with there in the mid to late 90s.
And then did he make the introduction to Donovan?
Well, in a roundabout way, I met Donovan at a relay practice in Stuttgart, Germany for Worlds in 93, and he was really more of an irritant and chaos, and we had some strong words, and I said, if you think you got what it takes, why don't you come down and, make a commitment and see.
And then what happened?
Well, every month he'd call and say, I'm coming, and then finally, I think it was March the following year, he showed up.
And the story continues, just for people who are
and
familiar.
So, the first year I think he ran maybe 10, 12, did the sausage circuit in Europe, rode a lot of trains, stayed in crummy hotels, and got in a few Golden League meets, they were called at the time, and, acquitted himself well. And then in 95, kind of figured a lot of stuff out and won the world championships, and, the rest is kind of history.
Who was he competing with? Who were his key rivals at that time in the early years?
I would say Frankie Fredericks, Linford Christie, Dennis Mitchell, Otto Bolden.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, you mentioned the long jump, and I wanted to ask you a simple question that I think has probably a more complicated answer. I did a little bit of homework, and I've been wondering about this for a while anyway. Why is it that the world record in the long jump was set, I calculated 23 years ago? So why haven't jumps held at that level, or why have they deteriorated, all of that stuff?
Well, I think you had a very special guy in Carl Lewis, and Mike Powell had a couple special years. But, if you pull those two guys out of the equation and you go back to Larry Myrick's and, the guys that were, also on the stage at the time, I don't know that we've dropped way, way off. I would say some of it is programming and coaching and, talent ID and it can be sports medicine. Guys are training harder, competing on more difficult surfaces, and as sports medicine kept up with the stressors as they've increased. Back then, worlds were only every so many years, and now you've got a Worlds and an Olympics or Europeans every season, sometimes both. I think there's cultural, and I think there's physiological and probably sociological rationales for why the event appears stagnant.
Yeah, and isn't it just one of the few that haven't shown growth or improvements in world record times, but actually have kind of fallen back?
Well, I mean, if you go to the women's long jump, it's fallen way back from the 80s.
What's your personal opinion about it? Because I have to say, from my very amateurish point of view, it's a beautiful event. It's fantastic to watch. But what's the problem?
Well, it's a sticky wicket, but I think that current drug testing protocols and regimes may have influence on the absolute numbers, not implying that any of the people that were at the top at the time were, of that ilk, but I think there's quite a few events, if you correct from what you were seeing in the 80s and early 90s and what you see now, it's a different game. I mean, we see Hannah England and people like that making finals and challenging for medals. With the EPO stuff that was rampant in the 90s, she would have had no shot.
Well, tell us about your work with Greg Rutherford, because to my mind, that's one of the undertold stories, undertold achievements of the British team in 2012 in the iconic London Olympics.
Yeah. Well, I guess Greg was, there's no secret he has a huge injury history with dozens of hamstring and adductor tears and, foot issues and surgeries. And when I was hired, I think he was kind of at the end of his rope with his coach, and his coach was probably at the end of his rope with Greg. And Charles suggested we meet, see if there was common ground, and we had a series of conversations over a couple-week period of time, and he felt good about making a change, and I, being in my role, Charles said, "You're the guy," so I was the elected coach.
And is it a case of chemistry to a certain extent, personalities that match up, or why do you think it was such a successful?
No, I think Greg is a very introspective, thoughtful thinking kind of athlete, and so you have to teach at a high level to keep him interested and motivated. And he doesn't, like to do things without understanding why, how, and when. And so you have to be very, very detailed with the teaching and the corrections. But I think a lot of it was identifying KPIs, key performance indicators, things that absolutely had to be trained, and eliminating a lot of the esoteric stuff. And, it took a lot of experimentation and research, but in essence, it evolved out that this was a kid that could only train about 3 days a week. And there's not a lot of coaches around that would entertain the idea of training a guy 3 days a week all year long.
And would they be presumably 3 non-consecutive days?
Yes. So on the other days, it wasn't like he's sitting on the couch eating bonbons. You know, he was involved in rigorous soft tissue therapies and, you know, various prehab type protocols. So it wasn't like, you know, he wasn't at the center. It's just he could only do classical training about 3 days a week. And then we found out that, you know, he got strong really fast, and he had we called it a Maserati engine with a Volkswagen chassis, so it ended up where he could only really lift strongly about once every 10 days. If we tried to go any sooner than that, then the injury numbers just started to elevate.
Just let me check that.
So,
did you say once every 10 days?
Yes.
Wow. Okay. So
if you want to have a straw vote for the most undertrained guy in the London Olympics, it would probably be him in a classical sense. But I look at coaching as figuring out the right dosage for the athlete for that day, for that week, for that month. And for Greg, that dosage was, you know, 3 or 4 training days a week and lift, you know, every couple weeks, and it seemed to work.
So on the days that he lifted, would that also include one of the training days when he was doing more classical?
Yes. Yeah.
So he would lift and do long jumping, or?
Well, he might sprint and lift, or he might do a long jump work and lift. You know, it just depended on, you know, how the program or the cycle was set up.
Mm-hmm. I mean, some people talk in terms of minimum effective dose. Does that have any resonance? Can you say something about that?
Yeah, I believe very strongly in that principle. I think a lot of athletes and coaches get sucked into what I call volume and density traps. So they train certain items too frequently, and they train way too much volume when they do train it. And I don't think people research and respect rest and recovery and, you know, regeneration type work. You know, it's kind of an afterthought rather than a driver of the system.
Mm-hmm. And the other concept that I've come across is this idea of survivor bias, that, you know, you don't necessarily have the best absolute athletes. You have the athletes who are best able to withstand, you know, 6 days a week of really intense training. Have you come across that?
Yeah, and I think that's probably, you know, going back to our early question, why maybe the long jumps are where they're at. You know, we haven't had that unique animal that could survive current training trends and, you know, still run real fast and jump real far.
But in theory, you could, if you had your pick of, you know, the entire sprint population, you could hand select somebody and maybe break that absolute record in the long jump.
Yes. Yeah.
But I'm guessing that there's a gravitation over to the 100 meters and the 200 meters, but especially the 100 meters because there's a lot more money there, to be blunt.
Well, and that's what I was meaning about sports sociology. You know, you can run in small meets and get $5,000 running 100 meters. You go to a small meet, a long jump, you might get $500.
Mm-hmm.
So professionalism has really changed since the 90s, and, you know, shoe contracts have gotten more difficult and tricky, and meets have died away. You know, in the old days, you could find 30 or 40 meets in Germany every summer, probably another 10 or 15 in Italy, another dozen or so in Spain. And now there's very little.
Mm-hmm. Now, was it Donovan Bailey? I read a bunch of things in preparation, and there was a race with Michael Johnson, a 150-meter race. Was that?
Yes.
Where the prize was 1.5, I can barely say it, $1.5 million. Is that really possible?
I think it was $1 million winner-take-all affair. And I don't know what guarantees were underlying that. I just coached. I never got into the money end of things. Mm-hmm.
But I guess it just underlines how much is at stake for just a tiny, you know, in the grand scheme of things across all the events in track and field. It's just one distance, really, somewhere between 100 meters and 160 meters or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and the thing that people don't realize in a lot of these meets, if they get a big name or two and they pay their appearance fees, then there's not much left over, for the masses.
Mm-hmm. And in your involvement over the, I guess, last couple of decades, is that getting any better? Is it getting worse? I mean, obviously, we'll put Usain Bolt
It's getting It's getting much worse.
Is it? Because even beyond the Carl Lewis's and Michael Johnson's, it's even beyond that.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Well, what can be done? Because I assume you have some views on what would be in the best interest long term of the sport, or of the full range of events in track and field.
Well, obviously, I think the IAAF and the country's federations need to kind of reevaluate how they package and market. Mm-hmm. I hear this deal, smaller meets, quicker and all that, but yet, people go to UK trials, they go to the U.S. Olympic trials, they sell out. If it's a good product and the names that are promised show up and compete, mm-hmm. People come. But I think that overall there's a lack of innovation and vision for how to market this sport. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you look at tennis or golf and you look at the prizes, and if you went 100 deep in track and field and you compared that salary to 100 deep in golf, men or women, tennis men or women, it would be a huge gap. Mm-hmm. So I think it's about leadership, visioning, marketing, and, the world economic crisis has not been, a help either.
Mm-hmm. I guess one of the things that I've noticed living in a big college sports town is there's a tremendous amount of draw for basketball and football.
Yes.
And that's what's changed over the last 20 or 30 years, that people are willing to pay what I would consider good money to watch, mid-level universities play each other with a bunch of, 19 and 20-year-olds.
Well, I think that's a credit to marketing and strategies and visions. These various conferences and whatnot that get these huge TV deals with Fox and ESPN and the various networks, that's vision, that's marketing, that's a strategy. I mean, we're lucky in America if we get our national championships with a 1-hour synopsis tape delay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's very bizarre. And then once every 4 years, suddenly people who've been performing at the top of their game and at the top of the entire world, the other 3 years and 360 days or whatever it is, are huge stars, and then it stops.
Yeah. And again, I go back to the idea, if these people, 3 months from the Olympics through the Olympics are such noted people, and they do these specials and documentaries on them and all that, that's marketing, that's vision. If you can do it for a short period of time, why can't you do it over time?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And you would think that they could certainly make a lot more out of the World Championships that are obviously an absolute title. And it always amazes me that, you can win the World Championship one year and nobody knows that. And then, if you had an injury or just some fluky kind of performance at the Olympics, you're nobody, even if you won the World Championship the year before and the year after.
Well, I think that responsibility falls back on the IAAF and the local organizing committee and, the individual federations agreeing to marketing strategies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're right. If we can go back to your work with Greg Rutherford, because I think that's also very interesting. I'm sure you're aware there's been a lot of, I don't know if we want to call it speculation, a lot of opinions back and forth about, nature versus nurture, particularly the sports gene now is heavily emphasizing a genetic component to performance in some of the less complex skills or performance activities. But you take somebody like Greg Rutherford, who, let's let's call it what it is. He's I imagine genetically of Northern European extraction.
Yeah.
So he shouldn't be able to jump like that, according to particularly the theories that are very heavy on, the preponderance of of athletes of West African origin, for instance.
Well, I mean, last year's number one, Menkoff, is obviously Eurasian. Mitchell Watts from Australia, who was silver medal, many times silver and bronze. I think these are just guys that have really good speed and really good elastic plyometric ability with, good coaching and programming, and, they can compete. There's, if it was raw speed, then sprinters would be making money over in the long jump. If it was just jumping ability, then, basketball guys could come out and make pocket money on the weekend. There's a huge skill requirement to the long jump, and skill acquisition and perfection and evolution, boils down to coaching. And, I think some of the third world countries may not have access to, the higher level of coaching and expertise and wisdom that, is required to produce a podium finisher in an Olympic game.
And I guess on the genetic side, there's this increasing, or has been this increasing sense over the last 2-3 decades that this is something that people of Northern European, or frankly any European extraction, aren't going to be good at. So what's the point? Why even make an effort? But then you have a Greg Rutherford who wins the absolute gold medal in the Olympics. You have somebody like Christophe Lemaitre, who, you'll know more about this than I do, but isn't he the first athlete of non-African descent who's under 10 seconds in the 100 meters?
Yes.
So these guys are proving that you can compete at the world-class level, or above the world-class level, really.
And I think that's the danger of stereotyping and taking leaps of faith with, books, articles, studies. What I see in North America is kids get culturally shunted into sports where, their race or their culture can have a higher chance of success. But to be, for example, to be a world-class long jumper, you have to be able to come down the runway 10.3 to 10.8 meters per second at the end of your approach. There are millions of white guys that can do that. There's thousands of Asian guys that can do that. Then you need a certain vertical velocity factor off the board. Again, there's huge populations in non-West African gene pools that can do that. So I think you get into sports sociology where kids at a very young age are guided and nudged by well-meaning parents and coaches and advisors when, maybe their dream or their heart or their interest is, in another event.
Well, I'm guessing, and you've spent some time in the UK, I'm guessing there are probably hundreds of Division I, Division II soccer players, footballers, who could probably be reconfigured as fantastic track athletes.
For sure.
But what's been your experience of that conversion process? Because I imagine that if you're in your late 20s and you're stuck in the lower divisions and it's pretty clear you're not going to make it up to the Premier League, wouldn't it be sensible to maybe get some excellent funding and get yourself an Olympic medal if possible?
No, I think that falls back in this sports sociology realm. If from the time you've been 8-9 years old, you told you're a footballer, or an NBA basketballer, or an NFL footballer, that's your dream. That's what everything you've done has gone into that. You get to 24 and it's not happening. Are you going to follow a similar dream? I don't think so.
So about what age is that critical make or break sort of psychologically?
I think it's university-type ages. In America, it's quite common. I think the statistic, students, is they change their major 4 or 5 times in their 4-year university career. Mm-hmm. So that shows me that mentally people are, making big investments and changing course, quite frequently during that age zone.
And that's when they might be able to commit to a different sport, but beyond that, it's kind of fossilized into an identity, I guess, is what you're saying.
Yeah. Like Donovan Bailey is rare. He was a basketball player, primarily, high school, university, did track kind of on the side, and then, at age 26, decided to get serious. I don't think I know or he knows why he made that decision at age 26. Something flipped, but, he's an outlier with that decision, in my experience.
Mm-hmm. You've said some interesting things about mental training. I was hoping you could expand on that, particularly this idea that mental training tends to be a bit compartmentalized, and from what I understand, you think it should be more broadly developed or supported by the athletes, the team around the athlete.
Well, I think that I think sports psychology gets a bad image or a bad rap because of people not understanding the depth and breadth of it. Mm-hmm. And I think today's athletes prefer things like mental skills training or mental strength training. Mm-hmm. There's kind of this stigma when you throw out the word psychology that something's wrong or broken or, drastically off. So when you use the phraseology mental strength, it kind of correlates like, I go to the weight room to get stronger. So got to go see this guy get mentally stronger, or, mental skills. Again, it kind of links to the sport motif. Mm-hmm. Personally, we do a lot of research in special forces training, specifically in mental resilience and coping and, the ability to change gears and stay on task. And once you phrase it and couch it and reference it with special ops training, you get a lot of buy-in with today's athletes. Well, these are really respected.
I can imagine they sort of see the competition as a bit of a battle that they need to be battle hardened for, I guess. How much time would you... If
you dig into the abstracts and the literature that's out there on mental resilience training and special forces, whether it's U.S.-based or Israel-based or, European-based, I have friends in all those realms, it's an everyday practice. Mm-hmm. It's an every week practice. It's an every month practice. It's included in all debriefs. Mm-hmm. And these debriefs can be mission-specific or daily-specific or task-specific. Mm-hmm. So I think the interplay of debrief and resilience training is probably where the sport future lies, in that realm of work.
Mm-hmm. So are we talking about maybe more than an hour a day in some cases?
Well, I think it has to be integrated. I think the coach has to be the director, if you will, mm-hmm. and has to coach with those thoughts in mind, those reminders. The coach is obviously in charge of a lot of debriefs through the day, through the week, through the month, mm-hmm. Working hand in hand. If you enlist expertise with the director of that agency or discipline, mm-hmm. and then the supporting teammates have to be conversant. It has to become a way of life within the training group, within the coach-athlete relationships. I don't think there's a squad commander in special forces anywhere in the world where it isn't just a part of the daily task.
Mm-hmm. And I think I heard you talk about the people around the athlete or the athletes asking tough questions and having tough
Yeah.
conversations. Can you say a little bit more about the kind of questions that you think maybe should be heard more often?
Well, I think it's real common for people to set goals and have goals, but then when you start talking to them, well, what are your KPIs? Event specific, overall, physiology, biomechanics, mental skills training, diet, nutrition. A lot of people talk a great game, and they can write lists and proposals for days that look really good, but the implementation of those things, that's the harder bit. Mm-hmm. So transparency and accountability in those realms are everything, along with just continuous debriefs and questioning of stated intents. Mm-hmm. Some people think that's harsh or blunt or direct, but standing in an Olympic Stadium in front of 80,000 people is harsh, blunt, and direct.
Mm-hmm. So it's kind of reminding them what they've signed themselves up for, and ensuring that.
I mean, you'll have a lot of athletes that lay it on the line on the track or in the weight room, but then their lifestyle's terrible. They don't sleep correctly. They don't sleep enough. Their diet's off the chain. They abuse alcohol or caffeine. Nutritionally super poor. You're not going to get on the podium that way.
And is that maybe what has changed most significantly in the last 10 or 15 years, this kind of zero scope or tolerance for transgressions of that nature and kind of lifestyle?
Well, I think it's a kind of a cantilever system. The more gifted you are, the more flippant you can be with some of these behaviors. Mm-hmm. But, if your gifts have ceilings, then to elevate your performance, you have to balance this cantilever system with, more correct behaviors in all realms.
Mm-hmm. Well, it'd be great if we could finish off with a kind of technical section. That's, one of your great strengths on that side is really almost like a micro-analysis of strengths and weaknesses. One of the things that I thought was really interesting I came across is some of the your thoughts about how core strength is trained or developed from some of your maybe less diligent counterparties in other areas.
Yeah. So could you clarify the question?
Yeah,
it's kind of a broad statement.
It was sort of a leading question, but one of the things I'm particularly amused by, and I wonder if you are as well, is some of the static work or the floor-based work that people are engaged in with building core strength, or things like the plank, holding a plank for 2 or 3 minutes at a time. Maybe explain to people who aren't specialists in the kind of speed and strength building that you're a specialist in, why some of these exercises maybe are not optimal.
Yeah. It's an interesting problem. I think core training has become a huge marketing tool for gyms and fitness centers and personal trainers and whatnot. And, you can put people in really weird positions and do things, really hard tasks, and they feel like they've really been worked out. And, they'll see body changes, and, that kind of secretes the deal that it's excellent. And people just get caught up in this core myth. Mm-hmm. Core is very specific to tasks. So if all you do is lay around the house or stand still, then doing, floor-based core exercises or standing-based core exercises, they'll have value to help you do those tasks. But they don't ensure core stability or core function if you start moving through space.
Mm-hmm.
So a pole vaulter running 9 meters per second, carrying a 5-meter pole, slamming into a box and leaving the ground, not even gymnastics core work will prepare the body for those forces.
Mm-hmm.
A sprinter running, 990, the forces that are being placed on the various muscle groups and fascial slings and joints, you could nowhere near replicate on a Swiss ball or standing on a floor or doing a plank or, a lot of these things that pass for core training. So I think probably the misunderstanding is, and it happens in a lot of training menu items, there is a specificity that can't be ignored. So if you never sprint really fast in training, the odds are of you sprinting really fast in a meet aren't very high.
Mm-hmm.
Correspondingly, how you use the core musculature and architecture in your task has very specific demands and forces upon it. There is not a great transference from the general to the specific in many menu items on the training program.
Mm.
At certain stages of development, maybe they have higher priority. So, for example, with a young beginning pole vaulter going into the gymnastics room may have great merit, learning body control and developing gross body strengths and muscle chains, that will eventually have some transfer to the pole vault. But if you're a 30-year-old world-class pole vaulter spending inordinate hours in the gymnastics room, it's not going to help you fight injuries or jump better in the pole vault because it's apples and oranges, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, what about a more generic challenge, a sprinting challenge? You'd think most people who want to be physically fit and willing to go to gyms that they'd be really keen to be able to sprint, 25, 50 meters to catch a bus.
Yeah.
Are you saying that time spent on a Swiss ball or doing sit-ups wouldn't necessarily help?
No, not at all. I mean, running fast involves skill, limb positions, force application, angles of projection. There's nothing you do in general core training that will enhance those entities.
Mm-hmm. Now, what about, I don't know how much you've come across this, big fitness trend of the last 5 years or so, fad, phenomenon, whatever you want to call it, CrossFit, where there's that intensity of moving from one exercise to another and kind of overall fitness. What's your view on that?
I'm not a fan. I never travel on absolute, so I'm sure there's some pretty cool CrossFit gyms with, coaches that know what they're doing and that do it logically and rationally. But the whole motif of doing technical exercises to exhaustion is not a safe practice.
Mm-hmm. So it's kind of a recipe for injury for a lot of the people who are pushing it.
Well, I think there are a lot of physical therapists and chiropractors and soft tissue people really happy that CrossFit exists.
But are they not seeking people like you and your colleagues out to make them faster for the really short running events?
No, it's a pretty closed fraternity, really.
Okay, well, that's a bit disappointing. Well, on that strength training, and just as a final series of questions, obviously it is increasingly accepted as something that almost every athlete needs to do, spend a lot of time in the gym, get stronger. I've seen some writers, commentators kind of simplifying it, saying, well, first goal for any kind of athlete, and particularly a speed athlete, is to get the athlete strong. And one of the suggestions I've seen is getting them strong by deadlifting. Now, from what I understand, you have a much more nuanced take on the role of strength training and, throwing weights around?
Yeah, I mean, I think strength training can be a trap. I think, again, it comes back to identifying KPIs. So if this kid's a jumper or a thrower or a sprinter or a long sprinter or a middle distance runner or whatever, what are the demands? What are the weaknesses? What are the strengths? What do we need to improve upon? Each lift or exercise in the weight room can be done well, can be done wrong, can be overcooked, can be undercooked. It's like task specific. What are you trying to get out of this lift? Is there transference, or are you chasing biochemical factors? Are you chasing neurological factors? Are you trying to get more motor units involved? Are you playing with synchronization? Then you get into questions: how strong is strong enough? Mm-hmm. What lifts seem to correlate with certain sections of the race? So, a big squat or deadlift may help your first 2 steps. Is that the only thing wrong with your race, is your first 2 steps? There's probably way more things, that you need to work on than just having a great first 2 steps. Mm-hmm. So I think strength training can be a real trap, and it can be misapplied. I personally don't think it should be a big part of the program for, youth and early high school type athletes. A coach is constantly juggling multiple balls on the menu list, and, I don't think strength should overrule technique or the various, training zones that you have for various exercises. And I think the best coaches balance, a half dozen to a dozen KPIs, and everything else supports those KPIs. Not one KPI drives the bus.
Mm-hmm. And if I understood some of your other comments correctly, you're saying that there's, this is not a benign or even neutral activity. It carries risks of injury, and I think you mentioned the potential for straining. I don't know if that's the right word. The central nervous system. Can you say more about that?
Well, when you lift with high velocities or high power outputs or high loads, there's a cost. There's a metabolic cost. There's a hormonal cost. There's structural costs. Tissues and fascia undergo distortions and perhaps micro-tearing. And, these are real factors that you have to weigh in with. How often do we do this? How much do we do? When do we tax systems? When do we moderate systems? So it's not as simple as saying, let's go in there and get as big and as strong as we can, and life's going to be great. Sport shows that isn't the case. There's plenty of really huge, strong guys not playing in the NFL.
Mm-hmm. And I take it huge, strong guys who are not able to get under 10 seconds in the 100 meters. Is there a movement away from these gigantic shoulders and pectorals and all that other stuff that looks really impressive?
I don't know. Sprinters kind of seem to be trendy. So, whatever they see the trend is, they mm-hmm. kind of follow the trend. There's very few sprinters that march to their own drummer. Mm-hmm.
So are they all trying to emulate Usain Bolt, or what's the trend at the moment?
Well, I think a lot of people look at Bolt as an outlier. He's mm-hmm. kind of a tall, rangy sort of guy. Mm-hmm. So they're like, well, I'm not tall, I'm not rangy, so I got to get big.
Okay, so there's still that ethos.
Yeah, I see a lot of guys way too strong, way too overdeveloped, mm-hmm. trying to run fast.
Including lower body or just upper body?
Both.
Mm-hmm. So your 30-second suggestion for them would be what?
Well, analyze your race, figure out where it's going wrong, mm-hmm. where you can gain time, and work on those features first and foremost.
Makes a lot of sense. Let me finish asking the question that I kind of like to ask because it's a little bit mischievous, because it's a little bit difficult, because coaches aren't used to kind of turning the tables. And that is to ask you about your own goals, maybe not really long-term, but just over the next 2 or 3 years. What are you hoping to achieve over the next 2 or 3 years?
I'm kind of at this stage of a career where you start giving back a lot more than you receive. So we have a very active coach education program and coach mentorship program with the center, and I'm really enjoying that. We have coaches from all over the world come in and spend 1, 2, 3 weeks, and we brainstorm and share ideas and network. And it's also, once you pass 60, that's when you get a lot of nice letters and emails from kids that you coached 30 years ago. And you reflect and you realize how you touched them in many ways away from sport. So I guess one of the goals is to keep getting those emails and letters and, realizing that your work transcends sport in the arena.
Well, that's great. It's very inspiring stuff. Coach Pfaff, thanks for joining us.
All right, thanks for having me.
That's all for now. If you'd like more information, check out the website SportsCoachRadio.com and the Twitter feed @SportsCoachTalk. Thanks for listening.